What's up guys, my name is Marc Steiner and today I'm here with my friend Gordon and we are comparing the Tamron 17-28 highly sought after lens to what you're viewing us on right now, the Sony 16-35 G Master. So let's get right into it.
First, let's start with the physical traits of these lenses. The Tamron is significantly smaller and lighter, weighing in at 420 grams, compared to that of the Sony G Master, which weighs in at 680 grams. Build quality is going to be significantly better on the Sony, and that's where most of the weight comes in. The Sony is also weather sealed, whereas the Tamron is not. The biggest difference right off the bat is the filter size. The Sony has a whopping 82mm filter thread compared to the much more common and reasonable 67mm thread of the Tamron. The Tamron is a very utilitarian lens with no additional switches or buttons, whereas the Sony features an AF/MF switch as well as a custom function button, which is always nice to have. The Tamron also has the focus and zoom rings inverted, which is a little bit off-putting, but is pretty easy to get used to. The Tamron focuses completely internally, but the Sony sadly protrudes when zoomed out. Now onto the IAF test. Both lenses do a terrific job of tracking. The Sony seemed to track just a little bit better, but nothing really worthy of the massive price difference. The Sony seemed to track a little bit better on the edges of the frame and did seem to have an easier time initially grabbing focus on the eye from a greater distance versus the Tamron. When in close range, however, there is little to no difference in the performance of the tracking between these two lenses, and even though the Tamron was unable to pick up the eye at further distances where the Sony could, at that distance, IAF becomes a slightly moot point because you can use single point AF, and since the subject is so far away and we're using a wide angle lens, everything is going to be in focus anyway. Both lenses had an easier time locking in on the eye when zoomed in to their respective maximum focal lengths. Onto the video AF test. After all the good things I've heard about the Tamron, I knew that the video AF was going to be very good. It's honestly kind of scary just how good the video AF is, especially when put side by side with the Sony G Master. If I were to lie and switch the names of these lenses, you probably wouldn't be able to tell which lens is which. Hell, I wouldn't even be able to tell. When they are both at their widest focal length, there is little to no difference in the performance. Both lenses have me in focus and out of focus pretty much identically. The first time I run towards the camera, the Tamron seems to wait until I've stopped moving and then quickly jumps to focus on my face, whereas the Sony seemed to track just a little bit better. But the second time I run towards the camera, the Tamron and the Sony both track me at the exact same time, and there is no difference. When zoomed into their respective longest focal length, you start to see a little bit more of the AF performance. First off, you can really tell the difference between 28 and 35mm. The second thing that stands out to me is that the bokeh just seems a little bit creamier on the Sony. I don't know if that's due to the lens design or the longer focal length. The Sony seems to track me better as I'm backpedaling, but when I'm running towards the camera, neither lens is able to track me properly, again making it scary how similar these two perform. The Tamron seems to get me in focus just a little bit faster than the Sony when I come back into the frame and hold that focus, and at the very end, the Sony manages to get me in focus just before I disappear as well as focus on the background faster. The Sony does seem to have a slight edge, but again, for the price difference, it's negligible. Let's move on to some photo tests. I put the camera on a tripod and shot these two photos of the longest focal length on both lenses, and as you can see, the difference between 28 and 35 is once again very evident. Again, to me the bokeh looks much more pleasing on the Sony. I shot this photo with the Sony at 28mm, and even here the Sony has a more pleasing bokeh to my eye, so it's not only due to the longer focal length. When zoomed in, we can see that the Sony is a bit sharper than the Tamron. I'll leave a link in the description down below with some sample images so you can pixel peep to your heart's content. What is interesting about these lenses is that the minimum focusing distance is actually much better on the Tamron, which can focus at 19cm, whereas the Sony requires a minimum focusing distance of 28cm. This can be helpful in tight spaces and can also narrow the gap a little bit when it comes to the shallow depth of field between these lenses, so this minimum focusing distance is a win for the Tamron and helps compensate it for the lack of a longer focal length.
Alright guys, so Gordon, what did you think about this comparison?
Overall, comparing the two lenses, they're pretty much similar for the most part.
Yeah.
The G Master kind of outperformed the Tamron when it came to the photo test or video test with the eye tracking by just a tad bit, but overall, they're very similar.
Yeah.
Were you able to watch the playback and get your thoughts?
I was. So you were saying off the playback that it does seem that the Sony tracks a little bit further into the distance with eye autofocus as well as just focusing better in general at that distance, but I think also at that distance, it doesn't really matter if you're catching eye autofocus because you're gonna be in focus regardless.
Yeah.
So for me, like, although that's nice, it's a nice little win for the Sony, I feel like it's kind of a moot point because it doesn't really amount to anything in my opinion.
Yeah.
And that's the theme for most of this comparison, is that like these lenses are both so good, the main difference is the price. And that's the deciding factor for a lot of people, including myself. Like, I've gotten to test out this lens, it's absolutely amazing, but I'm gravitating more towards the Tamron just because it's smaller, it's lighter, and it's only $900 compared to the $2,200 that is this lens. So you have to start to think, is that leap in price worth it? And in my opinion, it isn't.
Yeah, in my opinion, it definitely isn't as well, but there's that 1% who wants the best of the best and they're willing to cash out an extra $1,200, which is cool, you know. But
yeah,
for the majority of the population, the Tamron is phenomenal.
It is.
Whether you're doing it as a hobby or for commercial work, it definitely gets the job done, and the performance is
almost identical.
Pretty much identical.
Yeah. The biggest difference you're going to see is between the 28 and the 35. If you really need that extra couple millimeters in focal length, then you're stuck with the Sony. But if you're willing to sacrifice that little bit, especially when you pair it up with the bigger brother of this lens, the 28 to 75, then you don't really have any issues with that focal length. So yeah, I think that the Tamron is definitely the way to go for most people.
And my favorite factor of the new 17 to 28 millimeter is it does have internal zoom. So when you zoom in and out,
there's
it's
nothing
all internal
protruding.
versus
versus the 16 to 35, and there is protrusion, which I do not enjoy.
Yeah.
And I think it's much nicer to have everything internal. It's better for gimbal work for sure, because that way it balances better, it's smaller and lighter, which makes it compatible with more gimbals. Whereas this one is heavier, longer, and you can't get that perfect balance because of that little bit of zoom. So it is better for video, I would say, as well, if you're doing gimbal work, because it's easier. And overall, the Tamron just checks all of those boxes.
Yeah, and I know you use Ronin SC, and a lot of people use a Weeble. That's a smaller setup, gimbal setup. So having like a lighter lens like this is going to be way better to balance and get a stable shot. I don't know if you guys can see, but Marc will probably talk about this earlier in this video. But this lens it feels like half the weight of that G Master.
Yes, the Tamron is significantly lighter. And that means that on my gimbal, the Ronin SC, I'm actually able to use it and balance it because of that weight and size, whereas I can't do that with the G Master. Even though it technically is under the weight limit, it doesn't fit the size limit. So it's a little bit frustrating. If you're investing in nicer glass, you're going to have to get a more expensive gimbal. For a lot of people who have more expensive glass, that's not an issue. They're probably investing in a bigger gimbal anyway. But for a lot of people, you know, with a budget setup, with a smaller setup, size plays a huge factor into what you're doing with it. So I think that the Tamron is really nice to have, both for photo and video. It's gonna hurt your back less, it's gonna be easier on the gimbal. You're just gonna get a better overall experience, I think.
Yeah, so my overall thoughts on the two lenses: if you want to save $1,200 for pretty much the same lens, get the Tamron. If you want to spend an extra $1,200 for a tad bit better build quality and a little better performance, then get the G Master.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. If you're willing to pay that huge price difference, the G Master is the way to go. But if you're like most people, the Tamron is a very viable option, and you're not really sacrificing anything, which is really nice. All right, guys, my name has been Marc Steiner. This has been Gordon, and if you're looking for a full review of the Tamron 17-28, head over to his channel because he has a full review on this lens, and he does a lot of videography, filmmaking stuff. He has other awesome reviews, so be sure to check him out, and we'll see you next time.
Cheers.